Chapter 18. A Letter from Home. If Nikolai could be strong, I decided, then so could I. I walked and exercised, often with Mikos and Boris, who by then were also back on their feet. We grew stronger. Soon we were doing light chores, mostly around the kitchen. The work, cooking, serving, and washing tin plates, was not hard, and it reminded me of being home, of working in our restaurant, Küche Apfelstein, the orange kitchen. My grandfather had originally painted the kitchen orange. Grandmother made him paint over the orange. She said it was hideous. Then they decided it made an interesting name for a restaurant. I often saved a bit of extra food for Nikolai. The color returned to his face, and little by little he seemed to be getting his strength back. Despite what he had been going through, and of what he had lost, he was still determined to get better. One afternoon, while I was cutting up some carrots for a stew, feeling rather content, I oddly commented that the kitchen reminded me of home. Almost immediately, Mikos was on me. "Ah, you are starting to remember," he said excitedly. "Tell me, what else do you remember?" I was dumbstruck and had no idea what to say. For an instant, I was sure I had given myself away. Then I collected my thoughts. I acted. Play-acted. "We owned a restaurant," I told Mikos exuberantly, "and I was always helping out." I grimaced as though deep in thought. I frowned falsely, but that's all I remember. Then and there I decided it would be wise to show at least a little progress in coming out of my amnesia. It would seem less suspicious. I told people that the name Alexander didn't mean anything to me, but I remembered more about the battle at Tarnopol. And I chose to remember that I was from Odessa, Russia, because I knew something of the area from stories my grandparents had told me. Perhaps, more important, there was a minority of Silesians and Czechs in the region, and these people spoke with something similar to a German accent, sometimes even sprinkling their speech with German expressions. If I were to make any errors in the future, knowing these facts could save my life. Supplies began arriving again, and so did new cases from the front. The beds began to fill up. When mine was needed, I was given a cot in a storage room with 4 other men. The place was hot and stuffy. After 2 miserable nights in there, the group of us was granted permission to move into a vacant house not far from the school hospital. We were told it had once belonged to an eccentric, rather wealthy woman, the daughter of some famous Tsarist general. I had a room to myself, a parlor. In it stood an ancient piano without strings, and a large gut-sprung sofa. The place was old, musty-smelling, and quite dreary, but it was a lot better than the storage room. At 5 every morning, an alarm clock in a room around the corner from mine rattled us awake. There was no need to get dressed. We slept in our clothes. Before sunrise, the bunch of us would make our way the short distance through the streets of Alrini to the hospital. Sergo, our brain-damaged guard, was always on patrol, usually out front, sometimes lurking near one of the abandoned buildings. Though he knew who we were, he always demanded that we identify ourselves. After we did so, he would salute, and we would head inside, where we washed up, ate breakfast, and then went to work. Mikos and Boris were content working in the kitchen full-time, but more and more I started working in the wards. I mixed plaster for casts, I emptied bedpans, I cleaned up messes, I took out dirty, blood-encrusted bandages and burned them in oil drums in a field near the hospital. The work was grueling and hard on my bad knee, but at least I was doing something worthwhile. I was helping people instead of shooting them. The work had important bonuses, too. Out in the wards, I could check on Nikolai as often as I wanted, and I was around Tamara a lot of the time. "X, please bring me blankets. Please heat up water to bathe the new boy. And when you're done, X, please try to get some nourishment, soup, porridge, anything, into the man who refuses to eat." To this day, I can still hear Tamara's voice as she asked me, always sweetly and politely, to help out in some way or the other. I quietly did whatever she asked. Naturally, I had to help the other nurses and orderlies too, but whenever possible, I was at Tamara's side, following her around the wards like her little puppy dog. In late April, my identity papers, which I had to carry at all times, were amended and signed by Dr. Rostovich. Instead of a private, I was now Alexander Dukhanov, medical orderly, temporary, 5th Service Regiment, Southwest Sector. Many of the patients were illiterate, and one of my jobs was to write letters for them while they dictated what they wanted me to say. I can still see the large pad of cheap paper on which I wrote with a stubby, square-shaped pencil. The letters were usually very simple, and about the most ordinary sorts of things. The only difficult part about writing them was the need for the soldiers to inform their loved ones that they had been wounded, and trying to be cheerful and reassuring about it. But how does a young man tell his girl he can no longer father children, an aunt and uncle that he is so crippled that he can no longer help out on the farm, or parents he is so disfigured they will probably not recognize him? Letters and sometimes parcels arrived now and then for the patients and staff. Zoya and Reuben were in charge of distributing these. One afternoon in June, to my surprise, Reuben handed me a letter. "A letter for me?" I stammered. "But from whom? And how would anybody even know I am here?" "As best we can," said Reuben. "Zoya and I locate the relatives of all the patients, especially those who have passed away or those like you who are unable to do so themselves." "Thank you," I muttered as I took the letter. "Hopefully it will help you remember some more about yourself," Reuben added with a smile. I sat down and finally mustered the courage to open the letter. It read, "My dearest son, my heart is filled with joy. Your sisters and I have not heard from you in so long, and we feared the worst. But today we learned that you are alive, my darling son. We were upset to learn that you have been wounded, but happy to hear that the doctors say you are recovering well. They say that you have memory loss, but I will cook all your favorite dishes, and that will surely bring back all your memories. Anya and Ida and Grandpa are already planning a big party and celebration for when you come home. We cannot wait to hug you and smother you with kisses and spoil you. Write to us. Love, Mama." Reading the letter made me terribly homesick. It felt like it was a letter from my own mother. The letter also overwhelmed me with guilt. No, I hadn't killed the woman's son, but by taking his uniform and papers, I had filled his family with false hope and joyful anticipation of a homecoming that would never be. "What's wrong, X?" Tamara asked me late one evening. I had just finished my shift and was sitting alone in the kitchen, picking at my supper. I just shrugged. "You've always been so quiet and different," she said, "but not like this. Did something happen?" I shook my head. "Reuben said you received a letter today. Is that what's bothering you?" She pursed her lips. "I hope I'm not prying." I showed her the letter. "Why does it bother you, X?" she asked after reading it. "Because I don't know who these people are," I blurted in a twisted-up way of telling the truth. "I don't even really know who I am. I'm nobody." Leaving my supper unfinished, I stormed from the kitchen out a side door. "X!" I stopped in the middle of the road. I turned. Framed in a rectangle of light coming from the open door was Tamara. She slowly walked to me, then put her hand on my arm. "You're not nobody. Not to me you aren't," she said. Her expression was solemn, caring. "Yet, no, not to me," she said again, then hurried back inside. What had Tamara meant by this? That night I kept hearing Tamara's words over and over. "You're not nobody. Not to me you aren't." Long into the night I lay there on the lumpy divan. Was it possible, I wondered, that Tamara cared for me? It seemed she did, but what kind of feelings were they? Was it pity she felt, or friendship? Or possibly was it something more? Of course she had a boyfriend in the army, I knew. But was Tamara also starting to have feelings of that kind for me? I fell asleep with this wonderful fantasy in my head.